Hey, good afternoon, everyone. It is the latest installment of Hear from Your Peers. And we're joined today by, surprise, surprise, Dr. Joni Lakin. She's freshly back from a conference in Uppsala, Sweden. Did I pronounce that correctly? Yeah.
Uppsala. Everything has a different emphasis. Yeah.
A different emphasis. And also Janet Fraser, the gifted and talented coordinator from Oldham County in Kentucky, which is I would call it a large district, mid-sized to large district outside of Louisville, Kentucky. And so I want to let everybody know that, as usual, we will be sharing out the slides after the presentation today. The presentation today is roughly titled "The Biggest Lever for Student Growth, Ability Data." And you're going to hear some really exciting stuff about how the district in Oldham County uses their ability data. Yes, they use it for GT identification, but they also have many other things that they do with it. So we will be sharing out the slides. We are making a recording of the presentation, and we'll send everyone who registered the link. So if you can't stay on for the full time, or if you have colleagues who might want to see it who couldn't join us, you'll have a link to the recording, as well as we've got a question and a chat panel that are available to you. So everyone in the meeting is on mute except for Joni, Janet, and I, but you can type your questions in and you will find that they will get answered ongoingly, as well as we'll try to stop at the end and make sure that we get to everyone's questions. So that's what this slide says, everything that we just covered off. So the agenda for today, we kind of have three main topics that we want to cover. First of all, ability plus achievement. How exactly is that a lever for growth? We're also going to talk about the strengths-based approach to learning and differentiation that Oldham County is using. And surprise, surprise, they are looking at the ability profile, which is unique to COGAT. So we'll talk a bit about that. And then another key topic is that in order to really imbue the value of this information throughout the system, you need to enable other educators and staff in the district to really understand how it works and what it can do for them. So we're also going to have some conversation about how Oldham County has done that. So without further ado, oh, one more thing. We also have next Wednesday afternoon a session with Dr. Michael Connor. You can register for this on the Riverside Insights webpage on the link under events. So please come back and join us next Wednesday as well. Same deal, we'll be recording and we'll provide you a link if you can't join live, so make sure you register. Okay, now let's get into it and talk about Oldham County. So thank you for joining us today, Janet and Joni. And Janet, can you tell us a little bit about Oldham County Schools and your role in the district?
Yeah, so we're a mid-size, as you said, a mid-size to a large district in Kentucky. We have around 12,000 students total, a little more than that. We have 9 elementary schools, 4 middle schools, and 3 high schools. We're a pretty high-performing school district. We have 11% of our population as gifted and talented, identified. There are probably more. We just, it's a process of identification and training. But we have a little bit about our gifted program. I'll tell you that. We call our gifted program GATES, Gifted and Talented Educational Services. And we practice cluster grouping and accelerative options. We have a thriving pull-out program at elementary. We have what's called the Gateway, and students come 1 full day every other week. Our teachers teach there and also coach and collaborate with cluster teachers. We also have a dedicated certified GT teacher at every middle school with GT class as a part of their scheduled rotations. And right now we're working on our high school services. We're having a pilot year after the last couple of years of COVID, when it's kind of a time to reset and reestablish. So we're doing some exciting things there. As far as my role, my main responsibilities as Director of Gifted Services, I feel like I'm in a big advocacy role for my subpopulation, for GT. I think whenever I'm at a voice at the table, it provides a bookmark in the people's minds to remember all students. When they say all students, it includes GT students. And so I oversee the GT program, all the things, just like everybody else listening. I do all the things. You know, there are very few of us in a district, and so we kind of are islands to ourselves. So I think having webinars like this with you guys are really important, and I commend you for hear from your peers, because it's benefited me quite a lot. So I'm happy to be part of that. So anything else you want me to add, Vicki, in our conversations leading up to this?
Oh my goodness, well, we have a lot to get to, but one of the things, I pulled this off of your district's website, and this is not a rainbow or gate that is specific to your gifted and talented. This speaks more to the district's entire mission and vision. And a couple of things that I thought were really interesting about this are that in the spot where we would have a keystone, critical thinking and problem solving is highlighted here, which I think is super important. And then a couple of the foundational pieces are rigorous curriculum, student engagement and learning, continuous assessment, intervention, and then enrichment and acceleration are highlighted here as foundational pieces. So, you know, you've mentioned your district is fairly high performing. You have a lot of students who are identified, but it also seems like you are in an ecosystem where the district is pretty committed to some of these, you know, main ideas in terms of how we've talked about approaching education with critical thinking. Do you have a lot of support from the district in terms of your role and mission?
We do. Our Board of Education is very supportive. You can imagine, with about 1,200 students in our GT population, that it draws a lot of attention. Our parents are supportive, and it's kind of one of those things where if you build it, they will come. And our GT program about 17 years ago was pretty non-existent. It existed mainly of, I hate to say it, but teachers and whoever was in the know, PTA parents. There was really no compliance with the state regulation. So they took stock. They had a panel of stakeholders do a 2-year kind of reevaluation of where we are as a district. We had a new superintendent. He made it one of his initiatives, that in our performing arts program, to get those rolling. And so they decided, out of one of the outcomes was to hire 2 people, one of which I am, and we were then charged with building the program. And so, you know, when we started, for example, I had 53 students at elementary identified. Now we have about 175 identified, and it's because we put measures in place according to our state regulation that removed bias and included other kids. It made it, and one of the first things that they did was purchase COGAT. And because they took the state regulation at face value and said we have to comply, and it's written in our state regulation to have a screener to do a census of the entire population. So that's what we did. And one of the other things that I'll mention about this rainbow that we have, this sort of rainbow graphic, is under review right now. We're updating it and adding some other cool things in. We're really focused, as a lot of school districts are, on world-class learning and defining that and what it means for our learners. But one of the cool things about our PLCs, our professional learning communities typical to have 4 questions, but we always ask the 5th question, and it's because our population requires it really, which is what do we do if the students already know it? So that's our 5th question. We spend a lot of time there. So that's
a
real.
good idea that you are updating your rainbow. I just want to show this slide real quickly for people who are wondering. This is where Oldham County is, and 16 schools, including 9 elementary and 4 middle, which, as you mentioned, that's where a bulk of the focus has been, and you're working on your high school programming right now. One of your responsibilities in Oldham County has been overseeing the gifted testing using COGAT, and we're thrilled that you use COGAT, and working with your building educators for identification. You also mentioned removing bias or working to remove bias. So what does your process for identification look like?
Well, I mentioned that it's hard because there's not a sequence of 1, 2, 3. But if I were to kind of put it in that, just for the sake of explaining it to all of the listeners, we sort of think about 3rd grade as our look. In Oldham, or in Kentucky, we start identifying kids start serving kids in 4th grade, but we want to be prepared to start serving them when we start in 4th grade so that we can cluster them appropriately prior to the school year starting. So we begin in 3rd grade screening because it's a big process. It really is a year-long process for these 3rd grade students. So our window for COGAT screening for our entire 3rd and 6th grade is about to close next Friday, at which point, and so now that we're online for the first time this year, which results are immediate and wonderful, then we're able to analyze that data. But let me back up and say that going along with the screening, what we do first is ask our teachers. I think I was at a training that you and Joni did years ago at NAGC where you talked about that. And I know it's written in one of maybe the planning and implementation manual too. And I took that at face value and tried it. And so we ask all the teachers in 3rd and 6th grade whose students are going to be taking the test, just to kind of make a guess, if you will, a prediction. It's not a gotcha. At first they thought it was a gotcha, but when nothing happened to them except good things, then we had buy-in. And so we asked the teachers to make a list of all the students that based on their observations and what they've seen out of them at this point in the school year would probably hit on COGAT. And by that I mean might need extra services. And I always say it like this: I look at GT as an intervention. So I ask them who by their performance needs an intervention to grow, and so that's how we start. I call it the discovery process. We're trying to discover students who need this intervention. So so that's how we start. And oh, I see up on the screen there I tell you what, if I'd known that was going to be in a webinar someday, I probably would have put a little more fanciness to the document, but it is what it is. So but it's what we do. So we have the teacher list, and then when we get COGAT scores back, we put them into this tool that then we analyze, and this is just our process. So kids come back, and if they have a 130 or higher, which is our cutoff, that's our benchmark starting spot for GT in our district. And so if they hit on GT and the teacher list, they go in that spot. If they hit only on COGAT and not teacher list, that's really important. That is an important piece, and I can talk about that in a second. Then we feel like the standard error of measure is really an important place for GT kids, because I know that other people, I'm not the only one out there that has witnessed this, but our GT kids sometimes don't perform well on the group testing. Their super sensitivities and their high awareness of noises and movements and And even just knowing for them, this is a high stakes test because it means they get into one of our programs, which have now developed a reputation of being something that GT kids need and want. So there's a lot riding on that for them. And these are the kids who that 10 minutes really matters, because if they're distracted at all, then, you know, we have one school where every time I go in to do testing, it's on the other side of a hand dryer in the restroom, and that banging every single time distracts me, and I'm not even taking the test. So I've gotten to the point where I won't test in there anymore. And I talk to the schools about being mindful of the environment that their kids are being tested in, and the proctors watching out, being careful to make notes of any students who seem distracted or who seem frustrated. A lot of our kids have test anxiety. So I think the standard error of measure is really maybe more than 50% of the time when we retest kids who fall in the standard error of measure. I haven't really gone back to look at this document, but I could, to see just how often the kids retake the test and then do have a higher score the second time around. But this document, you can see the questions that we use with it. And the piece that I think is really interesting is whenever the COGAT comes back and the kid wasn't on a teacher list. That's a really big piece, because our next step then is it's informed for us to know why, and to go back and dig in a little bit with the teachers and say, this is no accident. This test is hard. And if this kid hit here, it's not an accident. So let's dig in a little bit, and that helps us to know how we can kind of come alongside the teacher and give some tools of things that will help them with those students. Sorry, I get wordy. You know how that is. I've said, you just pull my string and let me go. So
You want to know all of it. Actually, they say that about me. Well, I wanted to, I breezed by this slide real quickly, and this provides some nice context for folks that are with us today, especially those who are familiar with the COGAT dashboard. Because if we look at the whole district in Oldham, you can see they are high performing. So their mean score is somewhere between here, where for a typical population, it would be over here. However, as we look at some of the other buildings in the district, you know, even though we kind of maintain that high performance and we see that bulge happening in the 6 stay-9, which can be about 1 standard deviation above the mean, we still see some differences in your building. So for instance, here's a building that has very few students below average, very few, and a big bulge at 9. These are kids who are really high ability. This is 96 percentile and above. We have another building here that is much more close to normally distributed. So in this building, we're serving a full range of kids, every level of ability represented, from kind of the lowest, least able kids to the most able kids. Here we have another building still maintaining that nice high mean score, but we aren't finding any kids in that highly able bucket. So this is kind of a demonstration of the nuance of the kinds of things that you need to look at, as well as the fact that even a district that is a high performing district still has a lot of needs to serve, and that's why I included this in here. I don't know if you had any comments or questions you wanted to add about this particular slide.
I think you very adeptly explained that. And it's one of the things that is sort of the point of entry when I go into work with students, is to take this data. I often will start with a group of people and say, after explaining what the bell curve, by now all my people know what the bell curve is, because I think that they see me as the bell curve. I think they see my whole shape as the bell curve because I talk about it all the time. But yeah, so I asked them to make a prediction before we look at their data, draw their bell curve and where they think their students, what their distribution looks like. It's really shocking and very surprising what they see. But when we look at this, it's how we enter. It's how we enter, like that school that has so many, the bell curve is really shifted, the middle one, and it's shifted off to the right. That is a school where we come in with some really strong growth, some acceleration. I'm looking right now at 2 kids for grade skipping right now, and we grade skip pretty often. But that population, one of the problems, as you can guess, that the teachers at that population have is that all the kids are so high performing that they have a hard time delineating between who's GT and who isn't, because they all are at the upper end, more at the upper end than the bottom. And then some of these schools that don't have any GT kids, they think, with none at the 9th, stay 9, that's a different issue. It's what is happening with the population? Why are the kids are there? They're just not hitting on that test. So we do some things like that, like look in and visit PLCs and look to see what's happening and kind of dig in to the grades before 3rd grade to try to figure out what is going on with the kids.
Well, and in fact, you mentioned that one of the things you're using is a cluster model, and that's something that Dr. Lakin talks a lot about in terms of differentiation is clustering effectively. And what we see in terms of different buildings across your district would require different strategies for clustering.
And that's one of the questions that just popped up in the Q&A panel is this a tool that can be used to address students at the other end of the normal distribution? And absolutely. I think there's a lot of really useful information. And I'm excited to see Janet talk more about how they use it beyond just GT identification, because there are recommendations and ways of shaping instruction, no matter where you are on that bell curve.
Joni, I would like to see Janet use it in other populations as well. That's a really good idea. We have started using COGAT a lot in our other populations, so we can talk about that in a minute. But using that tool, I hadn't thought about that, so thank you.
Well, so when you're working to ensure that your district gets the most out of the time and effort that you put into ability testing, I mean, your census testing at 2 grades, grade 3 and grade 6, and you're also doing referred students at some other grades. So, how do you use that data? Besides, we took a look at your comparison matrix grid. So you're making decisions about kids getting into GT, but then, there's a lot of other things that you're doing with the data. For one, you mentioned that you had looked at ability alongside the achievement data of students. And can you tell us a little bit about that and how that helps inform how you're using the information?
Yeah, do you mind if I give a little context first, a little backup? Because I think there may be some other people listening who are in the same boat. So you mentioned to me, and in prep for this thing, you used the word champion. How do I champion it? And that actually became a really big piece because COGAT is expensive and most testing is. But whenever you're only using it to identify GT kids, as we were before I came along and caught the vision, it was on the chopping block and it scared me. And so I thought, oh my golly, what am I going to do? But when money is an issue, as it is for our district, then that becomes a really important piece of the puzzle is how do you not lose what you already have? So some things that I had to do was I had to prove the cost effectiveness of COGAT. So one of the things I did that I know don't mean to make this a long answer to get to your question to get to your response to get to your question is I had to put an action plan in place. And I had to go before my superintendent in a one-to-one meeting and explain to him and show him and get him. He's a wonderful person. He's not our current superintendent, but he was a wonderful person, but he was just trying to do his job for the district and use taxpayer money wisely. And so I had to prove to him that this was, and it turned out to be a really great thing. But my action plan was to first point to our state regulation and point out the pieces of the state regulation that if he didn't adhere to, we would be in trouble because we wouldn't be in compliance. So I said, the state regulation says screen the entire population, and then I usually ask questions. So it says screen the entire population for all 5 areas of GT. And so COGAT hits several of those. We have 5 areas in Kentucky, and COGAT hits several of those areas. So I just asked a question, if not COGAT, then what? And that sat in the room and there was no answer. And so then I got the bell curve out and I started showing him why it was good for the underdogs, because he was always in favor of the underdogs. I was able to explain to him that GT are the underdogs in many situations because these kids are at the top end and they're not growing. And I could look at their achievement data, which I did, and pointed out to him, we use MAP. I pointed out to him that I used conditional growth and pointed out that our GT kids are not growing. They're here, but they're just staying there stagnant. And what could they do if we did, provide for them more? Then I also showed him ways that COGAT could be used for all learners. And so then that launches into the next piece of the conversation that we'll get into in a second. But I just really wanted to then, I then targeted impact groups. I thought about who would have the widest impact if they knew and understood the value of COGAT beyond GT. So I figured out who those people were, and then I started meeting with them. Other GT people were my first points because they also wear different hats. So those who wore different hats like ECS and ELL and 504, school psychs, mental health consultants, I just went right to them. And I asked, could I join their meetings? And I just became an advocate and kind of a bugger, I guess. But I just started joining meetings. And I had immediate access to assistant principals because they wear the GT hat at elementary. So that was a pivotal group because they're also decision makers in their team, in their buildings. And I also had access to GT cluster teachers. So that was a big piece. Then I made appointments with level meetings for the administrators, and I went and talked to them. And every time I went, kind of the piece that got their attention most was the conversation about working memory. Isn't that interesting? But I wanted to highlight for them what COGAT tested because they didn't really know. And when we talk a lot in our district about transfer of knowledge, and they understand transfer, I figured out, but a lot of people didn't really stop to think about the impact of working memory and that all kids fall across the spectrum with that, and that COGAT helps us understand that. So I told them that COGAT tests the efficiency of reasoning, like how efficient a person is with reasoning, and that if we know that, then we can understand how students are acquiring knowledge, how they're entering into the learning. Because if we can figure out the how, then we can move the kids. That's why I say that ability is the greatest lever to growth. If you understand those things. I'll take a breath and let you ask more.
I'm going to step back and ask Dr. Lakin to respond.
I thought that was a great answer. I wouldn't have added anything. Yeah. I mean, I think that's really interesting. It's helpful to me too to understand, what teachers and assistant principals kind of where they're already comfortable and know, and then what kind of their confusion is, because that's really helpful in talking about, test use and making sure that payoff for the district is as great as it can be. So I think that's really helpful to think about kind of the way that students learn and the speed and the ease at which they learn, right? That's just the big value of ability scores compared to everything else that you can collect.
Yeah, well, I heard some phrases there that I absolutely loved, and three of those were efficiency of reasoning. I love that. I don't think I've heard it put quite that way before. Transfer of knowledge, which is hugely important. And what that's actually talking to is then the other thing that you said is how they're acquiring and entering into learning. And so one of the things that I've been telling folks lately, because I think a lot of people don't really know this, when COGAT was started, it was specifically started as an assessment to be a learning aid. In other words, the fact that it's found this great use case as an identifier for students who are highly able is terrific. And it's a great use for what COGAT tells us about students, but that's not what it was actually designed to do. What it was originally designed to do was to be used to help understand how students acquire and enter into learning. And so it's wildly ironic that we find ourselves in the place of consistently trying to remind folks of its utility for learning at this point in time. I get quoted all the time for saying what we don't want is for people to leave the score in the drawer, you know, have a big list of scores, file it away in a drawer, and never look at it again. And it's not a good use, as you were pointing out, in terms of the taxpayers' money. It's not a good use of students' time of testing if we're not using that data for other things.
Mhm.
So I have a slide that's say, oh goodness, that the many hats that you wear, the demands on your time. We're so lucky to have you here with us this afternoon. I have a slide here that's an entree to the ability profile scores. Should we talk about that now? Would you like to talk about that now?
Yeah, I think so. I think now's a good time because I think it comes right into your question about how do ability and achievement work together. Because oftentimes I start with the ability profile. Uh-oh, excuse me. She's going to keep coming back. Joni, this is probably someone giving COGAT right now who needs Sierra's help.
You need to take a picture, Julia. I can talk to the slides.
Yeah.
Let me text her. Yikes. She'll keep going.
About the ability profile is that it's a really nice, concise summary of how the students performed across the assessment. Joni, you want to take it away?
Sure, yeah. We have the ability profiles are kind of this sort of secret code representing their range of scores. And the two big pieces of information are the level, so kind of their typical performance across the different domains of COGAT, as well as the pattern, so where they have particular strengths and weaknesses across the different domains. So yeah, we have the different parts. The first one is the median stay-9, so kind of their typical performance, like I said. And then, sorry, Vicki, what was that?
No, that works. I accidentally advanced the slide.
You went back.
This is the
Yeah, and
one.
then we have A, B, C, and E for like kind of the degree of difference between the levels. And then the last part is the strength and weakness. So here you see that most students have scores, you know, that are about the same or just a little bit. They have one that's a little bit higher, a little bit lower. So most students have consistency across the three domains. And less commonly, students have one extreme score or a contrasting score. So they may have one area that's much lower and one area that's much higher than the others. So that's what kind of the codes tell us. And there's also COGAT.com is a place that you can put in that code and get it translated into practical terms of how that student is likely to learn and to be successful.
Well, one of the things I like to highlight on this particular chart is if you look at this column over here on the far right-hand side, this is talking about our Day 9 students. Very small percentage of students overall, about 4% of students. But what you can see here is that those students are even more likely than other students to have a strength or a weakness. And in particular, if you take a look at the extreme, so the E profiles, and it's kind of funny because we get pushback from people when they see a student with an E profile. We get a certain amount of pushback where people go, well, is this a valid score for this student? And they're particularly concerned when they're highly able students. But the kind of the irony of that situation is that students who are that highly able, particularly in one or two areas, we don't expect them to be that off the charts in every area. So that means they're even more likely than other kids to have a strength or weakness, even an extreme one. Nice thing about that is it gives us something to work with.
Can I
So,
say one thing back there that is important for us as GT coordinators to do, and lead in our committees that make decisions of kids, is that those E's and C's and that explanation you just gave, Vicki, about the 9th stay 9 is exactly why we don't just use the composite to make decisions. We have to look at the verbal, the quantitative and nonverbal, so that we see in what mode, is that the right word, Joni? The mode that they reason, because that's how they take in and process everything that they're learning. Whether, so like if it's a verbal strength kid and they have an extreme and it's a V+ kid, that's important to know, because maybe in math class they're not doing quite as well, and that's because they process everything through the strength mode. Joni?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So the other areas, may need more support, kind of more structuring and scaffolding for that student to be successful. So yeah, we're all the time trying to talk people out of just looking at that composite score, because yeah, so there's an example here of a student with a noticeably lower verbal score, and that's really helpful information, especially once you kind of dig into the portfolio and see kind of other indications. As a student, English learner, are they, do they have some kind of, a learning disability, or is it just not their strength? And so there's different strategies for helping that student be successful in every domain, even if they do have a relative weakness. So it's not a matter of like, oh, they're not good at reading, so we'll just ignore that. It's how should you approach their learning in every domain?
and more COGAT history is that until it was either Form 5 or Form 6, so around 2000, COGAT did not have a composite score. It was something that the original author team was vehemently against, because they didn't want people to take that shortcut of saying, oh, this composite score tells us everything we need to know about a kid. And so actually, for many iterations of COGAT, we didn't even have composites. And composites do have their own use case. But it is really, as you just pointed out, Janet, it's really important to look at those different areas of the test. So one of the things that we had talked with you about is kind of enabling how this information cascades through the classroom. And so one of the things you had asked me to include was this organizer slide. Is this an example of something that gets used locally in Oldham County?
So we're not, we have a lot to learn. We have a long way to go. We have a lot of teacher turnover every year. We have people, but yes, every time I do a talk with people, I give this to them, because as soon as they grab on to and begin to believe in that COGAT ability matters, then they want something to do. They need to put the scores down. They need to start making sense of it. And they grab on to, I show them the bell. I start that way, and I show them, what they're looking at with statistics, and I show them that the 4, 5, and 6 is average, 7, 8 is above, 9th is GT, and then I show them, the below average and the struggling learners. And And so they need a place to record that, because the next thing they're going to do is start thinking in terms of this. Like, they honestly think I have a magic 8-ball. I've said that to you before, Vicki, because they'll say to me, I've got this student, and then they'll lay out something. Well, without even knowing the kid, I clickety-click on my keyboard and I find out their COGAT score, and I see the profile and I make a prediction. It's more than a prediction, because I know what their reasoning ability is. And I'll say to them, well, is this kid, and then I'll say, you know, based on their profile, what they are. Is this kid really strong in math but really struggling in reading? And every time they'll say, oh, how did you know that? That's exactly blah blah blah, you know. And then, because I have the guide for teachers that you guys put out, the short guide, and then the new one, which is amazing, thank you, more of that please. It offers me the what next, the next step. Like, okay, so this is what you do when you have strong nonverbal learners. So I told you this story before, Vicki, that on that sheet, I had a teacher in one of the trainings that I did, who is really great with their 3rd graders and their 4th graders, whatever grade they had at the time. It was low, like that low grade level. They prided themselves on great morning meetings, and kids, you know, but this particular year, their kids weren't participating. After this meeting, and she learned about COGAT, she put all of these kids down, put all of her kids on this thing, and realized that she had a vast majority of students in her classroom who had a nonverbal strength profile. She couldn't get over it. She was like, is this normal? I'm like, I don't think that's normal, but it's what you're dealing with. And so we talked about what she should do. So she put some things in place, emailed me the next day, not too long, maybe 2 days after, and she said, oh my gosh, my morning meeting has revolutionized. I went in, and instead of giving them a writing prompt to read and respond to, I took in a graphic representation of a, you know, like a map or some graphic. And she said it unlocked them. They could interpret and have conversations. And she said, this stuff is real. And I was like, and she was hooked. And then all you have to do is hook one person on a grade level team, and then they take that to the rest of their PLC and share what they did. And before long, you have people wanting you to come and meet with their PLC, meet one-to-one, talk about the groups of kids that they're serving. And that's kind of how we've grown in our district, is just start small, but start. One-to-ones, PLCs, grade level teams, whatever it takes.
Yeah, so what I was just kind of clicking through as you were speaking, and in particular, you mentioned about the guide. This is some of the kinds of guidance that gets provided at a very high level. So if you think about that organizer, and then you think about the students who, not that we like to put kids in boxes, but when we talk about clustering, you know, it makes things much more direct if we can group students efficiently. And these are some of the kinds of shorthand guidance that gets provided. So thinking about how to adapt and build on a given strength, or how to support a weakness. And then we also get into very detailed information about specific profiles. So for instance, grouping a bunch of students who are in the average area, and they, you know, they don't seem to have a significant strength or weakness. They perform pretty similarly across the assessment, is very different from working with a kid in the 9th Stanine who, let's say, has an extreme strength or weakness. And someone put in the panel, you know, is this one of the materials that's available on Data Manager? Yes, it is. We have a nice summary guide in the Data Manager Resources tab for COGAT, but you can also get information like this in the Ability Profile Interpretation System just by going to the URL cogat.com, enter a profile, get a bunch of information. Those of you who are teachers can also download the differentiated instruction report, which groups kids together, tells you which kids are in which group, and provides this same kind of guidance for those groups of kids. So let me step back and stop talking. So, you know, you've mentioned this interaction with this particular teacher and providing that context and that organizer. Do you have other strategies that you've used with helping your teachers find value in this information, ability as a lever to learning, if you will?
Yeah, I think teachers are so driven to grow all their students. I mean, that's our passion. That's what we want to do, is make sure that all of our kids grow at least 1 year's worth of growth while they're with us. I mean, that's the goal. And so usually I think a tip that I would give, if there were a starting spot for me where I've gained the most growth with teachers, not to overuse the word growth, sorry, is any of those students that have C's or E profiles, even B profiles, those are conundrums for teachers. And also the kids that come back with a nonverbal profile, those kids, like the verbal kids, I think I heard one of you guys say this in a training and it stuck with me, which is the verbal domain is the single greatest predictor of how students will do in school on COGAT, because school is made for verbal learners. It's made for like everything that we do, even if it's math, is usually in that domain. And so, you know, I try to talk to them then about those kids who have a widespread of a verbal and then a lower quantitative, because those kids they can fool you into thinking that they're great in everything. And then you place them in a math class when they get to middle school and it's over their head. And they're very average in quantitative reasoning and nonverbal reasoning. And so paying attention to those kinds of things with student placement when you're moving from, you know, like wherever your split from elementary to middle school is, that's a big piece. So I ask our middle school or our elementary GT coordinators to look carefully at the profile and make suggestions for class placement when they head to middle school based on that. And our middle school counselors are doing better at looking at profile alongside MAP. The other thing that we do, you asked in answer to your question, we use MAP. That's what our district uses for achievement, and we give it 3 times a year. And so we're looking to see then, do COGAT and MAP, does their ability and their achievement run parallel? Is it one informs the other, and they both inform each other, right? Like your COGAT can improve when your knowledge base improves, and slightly, not like it does with achievement scores, but still a couple of points within standard error measure or whatever. But then the MAP scores, if there's a discrepancy, a great discrepancy between your achievement and your ability, that's a good starting point with students. So I help them, and they're getting good now themselves at looking to see where those two are not running parallel with each other, because those are spots that are not often easy to grow, but easy to find, right? When you're looking at your data spread and you're looking at hundreds of kids, where do we start? That to me is where we've seen great success. Other places that we've seen great success are in groups of students that are maybe in elementary classrooms that, well, I think you had one of the slides up maybe, where there's a big spread and we didn't do a good job of cluster grouping, and there are a lot of kids on both extremes of the bell. And the teachers come and they worry about their GT kids. And I say things like, I'm worried about your other kids in the room too, because the GT kids on a good day, they're quiet and they raise their hand when you ask a question. But most of the time, they're going to blurt out an answer. And then what happens is the other kids in the room don't have to, they can stop thinking. Mm-hmm. And so you need to flex group, whole grade flex group those kids, do something with ability grouping at some point. And that's where that that DI organizer, the Stay 9 organizer, comes in really handy, and we use that a lot to help us decide on what groups, how the groups should be placed, so that all learners get the thinking time that they need to process and move things into their, transfer things into their long-term memory and their learning. And I'll stop talking.
No, we will hear you talk, but to your point, being the second Stay 9 student in this building is a much different experience, both for the teacher and for the child, than being the second Stay 9 student in this building. And that's exactly what you're pointing out.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it makes me think also of when Marcia Gentry was talking about the total school cluster model, right? One of the advantages is that the kids in the 6, 7, 8 Stay 9s have more opportunities to shine and to be the one who kind of knows all the answers. So yeah, it can benefit everyone to sort of sometimes separate out by ability levels flexibly. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I have so many slides here. I keep, I'm making myself seasick going back and forth. But yeah, this is a really nice organizer, and there's a copy of this in that guide that is posted on.
And this came from a school district. I think one of the reps in Texas passed this along, something that came from a school district. So yeah.
The dear beloved Scott Dittner, if you remember Scott, who worked with districts primarily in Texas and Oklahoma, brought this one to our attention several years ago, and it's a very valued tool, but there's no special magic to it. Like most things that work well, this is common sense and logic just laid out on a page, which is great.
It's better than, I mean, we were using something before that, but I like the visual of this one.
Yeah.
Because if you start using CoGAD, it requires you to somehow record all the information. You just really want to. You want to, like a logical step is, well, which of my students are verbal strength? Which of my students are quantitative? And then the next question is, well, what do I do now that I know that? And that's where that guide really comes in handy. And you guys, you knew, didn't you, what the short guide lacked was the next step, and then you came in with this new one, and it really gives some very, very good examples about what to do. And so I usually just clip out what is it, part 3, I think, part 3, 4, and 5, I think it is, and I just clip that out and print that off for teachers.
That's great, and that's one that we updated by talking to teachers. So we had a series of focus groups to kind of go through and make sure that it was still up to date, still useful. Vicki, there's a question about using this worksheet, and I think just to highlight for Vanessa, that Stay 9, so you start by putting students based on their median Stay 9, and then you put a plus and a minus anywhere that would apply, right, to each student. So you don't have to put the scores in or anything more specific. Go ahead.
If you list the student here, you would know that this student is overall a 7 or an 8 Stay 9. So this is a student at high average to above average. And then if we know that he or she has a verbal strength, we put a plus here. And if it were an extreme strength, I would probably put like a double plus, just, little shorthand to myself. So you have a sense of what the kid's overall range is, depending on, which column and row of the chart that they're in. But then the pluses and the minuses tell you, where the other attributes are that you can access to help these kids learn.
Where do you guys recommend? So this was one question, is if they don't have a plus or a minus and they have an A profile, which means they're the same in all domains ish, then do you just put them a strength for everything? That's kind of what.
Well, if I needed a visual for that, what I would possibly do is I would possibly write the kid's name down and put an A over here, or I might just put an A across, to just sort of indicate that But I like kind of leaving these columns blank unless they have a plus or a minus, because it's a stronger visual cue. So I personally, I would put an A probably next to their name over here, just so that I knew I didn't miss strength or weakness and go back and check my work 47 times. I'm very conscious of the fact that, believe it or not, this time has flown, and we're very close to the end of our precious hour with you. I told you this was going to happen. So I want to come back to a question that we always try to ask, because we find, particularly in the last 2 or 3 years, this has always been the case though, we meet so many people who say, I am new to this role at G&T and I don't know where to start. I mean, it's overwhelming. All the hats, all the pressure, all the kids, everything.
Yeah.
So if you were going to give somebody just 1 or 2 manageable hints, things that they might think about, and it could have to do with identification or programming or whatever you think, but if you were talking to this person and they said, I'm brand new to this role, oh my God, what should I do first? What would you tell them?
That's a good question. And I think it's important to know your state's GT regulation, because that guides your work. I answer to the assistant superintendent of learning, but I know what my regulation says, so that's what I have to do. And so knowing that, I use it, as I mentioned earlier, to support my program, to support initiatives that I want to take. We're evaluated on that. We were just audited last year. They call it consolidated monitoring here. And it really is the #1 thing. And for those of you who don't have a GT regulation in your state, advocate for one. Go get one of your neighbors. Go get someone next. Look at Kentucky's. Look at Colorado's, Texas. I mean, there's a whole bunch that are good out there. Ohio. Go to your neighbors and advocate. Be part of your state GT organization or affiliate of NAGC, and be a voice. Get busy about advocating if you don't have one, but you probably do. I think most do now have a GT state regulation. And then the next part that goes hand in hand with that is find out what your local Board of Education's policy is. Did they adopt the state regulation or not? Some of them do and some of them don't. Some of them make changes. So find out what those 2 things are, because that's your marching orders, right? And then I guess another thing that I think is, if I'm thinking about, reflect on your own beliefs, and reflect on your beliefs and challenge yourself and keep learning, and think about what you truly believe about students and learning, and research and read, become part of organizations that can help you. We have the several organizations here in Kentucky, and easy access to those people, and reach out. And then be sure your practices and your procedures align with those guiding documents of the state regulation and the Board of Education policies. But I can't stress enough, like, I don't know if Joni and Vicki remember faces or not, but I can tell them that when I first got into this role, I went to NAGC and I parked myself at every single thing about COGAT that there was. And I read all the manuals. I mean, I'm not kidding. I literally read every single manual, and it was Form 6 when we started. I read all those manuals and I learned a lot from those manuals. And then things that were discordant to me, or that I didn't understand, that I was at disequilibrium about, I searched out. I read other people, and I triangulated sources and found out what was true and what I believed, and I just kept digging in, and then I just took action on it. And so know what you know, and the more I know, the more I learn, because it raises questions and I find out what I don't know. And so then I dig in and learn a little bit more. So I just want to say to the two of you, thank you for your work in COGAP, because I mean, we're an example of your success. Like, we have something to use. We benefit from the work that you did and are continuing to do. So I appreciate you all very, very much.
Well, just in having this conversation always reminds me, you know, we're at this point, we're thinking about what's next. And so we're always thinking about what's next. So we have several conferences coming up, including NAGC, which will be in Indianapolis in mid-November. And this is an opportunity for us to hear from educators like you, Janet, and others who've joined us on the call today. And, you know, we want to keep iterating and moving forward. Dr. Lakin, do you have any closing thoughts? Because we really are at the end of our hour.
Oh my God.
No, I think this was a fantastic hear from your peers, and I want everyone to know I did not pay Janet to say nice things about me just then. That's, but I really appreciate the kind words. So yeah, great session.
All right, well, we're going to be out there at some state conferences and NAGC, and you know, you can always find us otherwise. We have another session next week with Dr. Connor, and so we hope to see you again soon. And Janet, we hope to have you back for a reprisal after this one. Let's do another one, because there's a lot more good work you're doing to uncover. But thank you for making time for us today, and hearing the phone ring, yeah, during our call just kind of drives home how precious this hour is. So we thank you. We thank everyone who joined us on the call today, and we hope to see you all again very soon. Thank you.